Inside Hollywood's most explosive feud, Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively's clash has escalated from creative differences to a full-blown legal and emotional war on and off set. Originally collaborators on a high-profile streaming drama, their conflicting visions quickly spiraled into lawsuits, public drama, and intense behind-the-scenes tension. With accusations flying about manipulation, toxic work environments, and power struggles, this feud has rocked the industry. Fans are divided, social media buzzes with debate, and the show, once highly anticipated, is now overshadowed by controversy. Both stars deny wrongdoing, but the fallout continues, leaving careers and reputations hanging in the balance. This is a gripping story of ambition, conflict, and the dark side of fame that you don't want to miss as the media frenzy around the feud between Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively grew even more intense. Part 3 of their unraveling saga took a darker turn, with new reports suggesting that the fallout from their conflict was no longer contained to their set or legal filings, but was beginning to radiate through their professional circles, personal relationships, and future career opportunities. While the court cases continued to unfold, new names began surfacing in connection to the dispute, including producers, directors, and agents who had once worked with or supported either actor, but were now being drawn into depositions, subpoenas, and public backlash. Several producers who had remained neutral in the early stages were now reportedly distancing themselves from the project, fearing association with the growing storm would harm their own reputations. One studio executive even leaked internal communications showing that projects involving either Baldoni or Lively had been placed on indefinite pause, pending the outcome of ongoing litigation. This was no longer just a feud between co-stars. It was evolving into a full-scale industry crisis, with reputational damage rippling outward like a stone dropped into water. Behind the scenes, both camps continued to engage in what some insiders called psychological warfare, each side hiring more lawyers, more publicists, and in some cases digital reputation firms to scrub negative press or push favorable narratives. One particularly aggressive campaign involved a now-deleted series of anonymous articles that accused Baldoni of being emotionally manipulative on set, using his producer power to silence female colleagues, while Lively's team was accused of planting stories that painted her as a victim of systemic abuse within Hollywood. The tug-of-war over public opinion became its own battlefront, with coordinated influencer posts, viral threads, and sympathetic interviews that often contradicted courtroom testimony. This attempt to control the narrative caused even more confusion for fans and media, who were now struggling to keep up with what was true, what was spin, and what was simply rumor designed to distract from the growing mountain of legal filings. While the stars fought to preserve their personal brands, the series itself began to suffer. Season 1, which had started strong in terms of viewership, began to decline in ratings as audience fatigue set in and critics shifted their focus from the content to the controversy. Reviews became less about the story and more about how impossible it was to separate fiction from reality. One highly circulated think piece argued that watching the show felt like attending a dinner party where the hosts are in the middle of a divorce. That analogy resonated with fans, many of whom began abandoning the series entirely, with comments like "I can't support this toxicity" or "This is just sad" now populating once enthusiastic fan forums. The studio behind the show attempted to revamp interest by releasing behind-the-scenes footage, interviews with other cast members, and even alternative episode endings, but nothing seemed to stick because by now the show had become a secondary character in its own drama. The real story was the implosion of a collaboration that was supposed to mark a new chapter in modern prestige television, and instead revealed the deep fragility of ego-driven creative partnerships. More disturbing was the growing number of former crew and support staff speaking out anonymously through union channels, detailing a pattern of emotional abuse, verbal outbursts, and erratic leadership on set. Some described long days filled with tension, others recalled being asked to choose sides directly or face professional consequences. Still others mentioned being told to sign new NDA letters mid-production without explanation or risk being fired. One key witness, a senior script supervisor, submitted a sworn statement alleging that episodes were regularly altered to satisfy emotional whims rather than narrative logic, and that both Baldoni and Lively used emotional manipulation to sway producers into backing their creative decisions. This individual also claimed that entire scripts were leaked, not by external hackers or press, but by internal team members attempting to sabotage the other camp through social media exposure and narrative control. These claims are now part of an ongoing internal investigation at the streaming company, which has remained mostly silent publicly but is said to be furious privately. with one anonymous executive quoted as saying, "We signed up for a show, not a court case, and definitely not a war zone." The internal fallout has also reached the network board level, where questions are now being asked about vetting procedures, power distribution on set, and whether the current system allows too much control to be placed in the hands of stars who lack the emotional maturity to lead large-scale productions. While both Baldoni and Lively were experienced professionals, the events of this production have shown that talent does not always translate into leadership, and that unchecked creative control can quickly turn a passion project into a disaster. Further complicating matters are the new countersuits being filed by third parties, including former assistants, stylists, and even vendors who claim they were dragged into the chaos through no fault of their own. One hairstylist alleged she was terminated after refusing to spy on Lively for Baldoni, while a catering company filed a small claims suit claiming they were never paid in full due to budgetary mismanagement caused by endless reshoots. These cases, while minor compared to the main lawsuits, add further texture to the growing picture of dysfunction and emotional damage that surrounded the show and its creators. In a shocking twist, a whistleblower from the post-production team revealed that audio files had been scrubbed to remove live confrontations between the leads that occurred mid-scene. One such confrontation reportedly included Lively breaking character to accuse Baldoni of gaslighting her while cameras continued rolling, and Baldoni demanding the footage be deleted immediately. To protect the integrity of the project, that footage was eventually destroyed, according to studio memos, but its existence has now become the center of a legal motion from Lively's team requesting discovery into deleted files and editorial manipulation as part of her countersuit. As this all unfolded, fans began asking how such a toxic production could have been allowed to continue for so long without intervention or accountability. The answer appears to lie in the complicated power structures of modern Hollywood, where stars who are also executive producers often operate above the level of traditional oversight, where legal teams are incentivized to protect brands over people, and where reputational risk is often calculated against streaming metrics rather than moral responsibility. With so much money, prestige, and audience engagement at stake, few are willing to pull the plug. Even as the situation clearly deteriorated in retrospect, many insiders now admit that the project should have been paused or restructured during early signs of conflict. But instead it was allowed to continue, creating a slow-motion implosion that has now consumed nearly everyone involved. For Baldoni and Lively, the road forward appears increasingly difficult. Sources say both are now facing challenges securing future work, with multiple projects stalled or canceled, and some major platforms quietly blacklisting them from upcoming slates, at least until the legal matters are resolved or reputational cleanup has succeeded. Even more heartbreaking are the reports that friendships and professional alliances have been permanently damaged, with agents parting ways, producers ending long-term partnerships, and actors who once spoke glowingly of the stars now refusing to comment publicly or engage with any press related to the show. What was supposed to be a triumphant creative moment has now become a cautionary tale of ambition, unchecked authority, and personal conflict allowed to metastasize until it took over everything. And as Part 3 draws to a close, it is clear that the toxic feud between Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively is not just about a show or a lawsuit or even fame. It is about what happens when the foundations of trust, collaboration, and respect collapse under the weight of ego, fear, and the desperate need to be right. In an industry where perception is everything and apologies are rare, the consequences are now being written in real time across headlines, courtrooms, and careers. As the legal feud between Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively reached its most volatile phase and public trust in both actors began to falter, Hollywood executives began whispering about what this conflict truly revealed about the entertainment industry, not just the behind-the-scenes drama, but the complete breakdown of artistic collaboration that once gave meaning to co-creation. The fourth part of this ongoing crisis saw the narrative shifting away from isolated grievances and toward broader questions of structural failure, industry negligence, and systemic dysfunction. At the root of the breakdown was not just personality conflict, but unchecked access to power and resources, with Baldoni and Lively both serving as executive producers. They had a level of control that allowed disagreements to spiral into full-scale meltdowns without any meaningful oversight or mediation. Insiders began referring to the production as a lull zone, where the whims of the leads replaced structure, and where professional norms were discarded in favor of emotional leverage, star power, and social media clout. Reports surfaced that at one point the showrunner attempted to step in and enforce boundaries, only to be pushed out by legal threats and studio pressure, creating a chilling effect that silenced even Those trying to restore order court transcripts revealed a particularly explosive moment, where a producer detailed how episodes were rewritten overnight, after receiving panicked text messages from both leads, each accusing the other of sabotage, demanding cuts or edits, and threatening legal action. If not obeyed, these demands were often contradictory, leaving editors and writers in impossible positions trying to satisfy both, while maintaining narrative coherence. One editor described the process as emotional blackmail dressed in creative language with no room for logic. Only Allegion's staff began referring to the show as a hostage situation, and some even began recording meetings and archiving correspondence in case they were later dragged into litigation. These recordings now form part of the ongoing discovery process, with both sides accusing the other of manipulating footage, lying under oath, and distorting timelines to paint themselves as victims. And as the accusations piled up, the court of public opinion grew more polarized, more fatigued, and more disgusted. With each new revelation came a wave of backlash, not just against Baldoni and Lively, but against the very idea of celebrity as something aspirational, powerful, or worthy of admiration. The once glamorous image of Hollywood creatives pouring their souls into visionary work had given way to a grim reality of narcissism, exploitation, and spectacle, with fans turning away from the show in droves, refusing to support either actor and demanding accountability, not just for the personal misconduct, but for the harm done to crew, staff, and the culture of the industry itself. Union representatives began issuing quiet warnings that the conflict was setting a dangerous precedent, one in which workplace toxicity was normalized if the numbers were high enough, and where mental health trauma was dismissed as the cost of doing business. Streaming platforms remained largely silent, hoping to ride out the storm and avoid being seen as complicit, but leaks from within the company revealed a much deeper involvement, including memos indicating they were aware of the conflict long before the public and chose not to act to protect their investment. By the time the show entered award season consideration, it was clear that no amount of spin could redeem its reputation. Even though some performances were technically strong, no major nominations were announced, and award show invitations were quietly rescinded in what industry insiders called a soft blacklist for both leads. Meanwhile, more witnesses began coming forward, expanding the scope of the case beyond creative conflict and into labor violations, ethics breaches, and retaliatory practices. A former assistant director claimed they were instructed to avoid eye contact with either lead during the final weeks of filming unless spoken to directly, a condition not written into any formal memo but enforced informally by department heads, hoping to prevent more blow-ups. This culture of fear and silence permeated all departments, from lighting to costume to props, and when the final episodes aired, many crew members chose not to attend wrap parties or participate in promotional efforts. Out of exhaustion and emotional trauma, Lively's team issued a statement denying all wrongdoing and insisting that any suggestions of abuse or retaliation were false and defamatory, while Baldoni released a cryptic video blog talking about spiritual healing and the cost of leadership without mentioning the show or Lively directly. Critics slammed both approaches, calling them vague, manipulative, and tone-deaf. Especially in the face of such serious allegations, it became increasingly clear that the feud had triggered a reckoning for everyone involved and that no one was coming out unscathed. The legal fight also began to bleed into other projects with overlapping timelines. Baldoni was slated to begin production on a new documentary, while Lively had signed onto a thriller, but both projects were quietly shelved as investors pulled funding, citing brand risk and potential legal entanglements. In one internal email, an agent warned a partner that attaching either star to a production would now require extra liability insurance due to their unresolved disputes and reputation for disruption. The damage was not just financial, but cultural. Both actors had spent years cultivating images of thoughtfulness, empathy, and artistic integrity, and those images were now being shredded by a paper trail of toxic behavior, court transcripts, and deeply personal betrayals. More than once during hearings, both leads were brought to tears while reading aloud from deposition letters that accused them of emotional warfare, verbal abuse, and betrayal of trust. In one particularly gut-wrenching moment, Baldoni reportedly broke down when confronted with evidence that a trusted colleague had turned over emails suggesting he tried to have Lively blacklisted from future network projects. Lively in turn sat expressionless, as her own former stylist claimed she intentionally undermined Baldoni in press briefings by feeding talking points to influencers designed to make him look controlling and unhinged. Even the most loyal fans began to step back, questioning how much of what they once believed about their favorite stars was genuine, and how much was simply branding. The feud had crossed into something deeper and more existential. It was not just a battle between two people but a reflection of the rot within an industry that prioritizes visibility over virtue, marketability over morale, and spectacle over substance. And while damage control efforts continued with both camps, hiring new crisis PR firms and attempting to reframe the narrative, the truth could no longer be contained. The documents were public, the stories were circulating, and the wounds were now visible across an entire ecosystem that had enabled two talented but deeply flawed individuals to become unaccountable emperors. In a crumbling kingdom, industry experts began warning that this case could define Hollywood's next era, especially if the courts ruled in favor of punitive damages or set new standards for on-set governance and producer responsibility. Advocacy groups began lobbying for reforms, ranging from third-party ombudsman roles to clearer conflict resolution mechanisms in creative environments where traditional hierarchies were no longer effective. As part 4 of the saga unfolded, the legacy of the show became increasingly clear. It was no longer about the episodes or ratings or artistic merit. It was about the consequences of unchecked ego, the burden of silence, and the emotional debris left behind when two powerful figures refused to yield, bend, or acknowledge the harm they caused not just to each other but to everyone around them. It became a story about leadership without compassion, vision without collaboration, and ambition without ethics. And as the final season was put on indefinite hold, the industry collectively braced for what part 5 of this public tragedy would bring. Because if part 4 revealed the system failures and emotional carnage, then part 5 was poised to expose the fallout in its purest form, a world where everyone involved is forced to reckon with the question of what it truly means to win a feud, when everything around you lies in ruin as the legal dust begins to settle and the industry surveys the wreckage left behind by one of the most toxic feuds in Hollywood history. The story of Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively now exists less as a cautionary tale and more as a permanent turning point in how power, creativity, and conflict are managed on set. What started as a shared vision between two influential actors turned into a public collapse of communication, collaboration, and character. Both stars now find themselves navigating careers stained by legal filings, emotional scars, and public perception damage that may take years to undo. The show that once held promise has been shelved, quietly removed from the spotlight it once dominated, and in its place remains only unanswered questions about how an industry that celebrates art and imagination could allow such devastation to unfold behind closed doors. As Hollywood slowly moves forward, the legacy of this feud remains etched into scripts, contracts, and crisis handbooks, a bitter reminder that unchecked control, fragile egos, and the relentless pursuit of dominance can turn any set into a battlefield and leave behind nothing but regret, silence, and broken dreams.